For a long time, the men believed every movement mattered. A pause, a mistake, even a glance felt noticed. Then, slowly, something changed. Orders still existed, routines continued, but the sense of being observed began to fade. No whistles followed hesitation. No consequences arrived after small violations. What unsettled them was not freedom, but the realization that no one seemed to be paying attention anymore. At first, nothing announced the change. There was no signal, no formal decision, no spoken acknowledgement that anything was different. The guards still appeared at the same hours. The fences remained in place, and the routines continued to unfold with mechanical regularity. Yet within that familiar structure, something subtle began to loosen, and the men sensed it long before they could explain it. In the early months of captivity, awareness shaped every action. Men stood straighter than necessary, spoke less than they wanted to, and measured their movements with care. Even silence felt regulated, as though stillness itself was being observed. The presence of authority did not need to be constant, because it lived in memory, reinforced by discipline learned long before capture. Supervision existed not only in watchtowers or patrols, but inside the mind. Over time, that internal pressure began to thin, not because rules disappeared, but because reactions stopped arriving. A late step in formation passed without comment. A missed response during roll call produced no correction. Small deviations, once unthinkable, occurred and were met with nothing at all. The absence of response lingered longer than punishment ever had, creating an unfamiliar uncertainty. The men began to notice patterns that did not align with their expectations. Guards rotated more frequently, often unfamiliar with the routines of the camp. Orders were repeated without enforcement, as if spoken out of habit rather than intent. Tasks assigned one day were quietly forgotten the next. No explanations followed these inconsistencies, and none were offered when questions were left unanswered. This lack of attention did not feel like relief. Instead, it unsettled the prisoners in ways they struggled to name. Being watched, even under confinement, had provided a strange form of structure. Observation implied purpose, and purpose suggested relevance. When that gaze weakened, it left behind an uncomfortable void, one where actions felt disconnected from consequence. Some men tested this new silence without meaning to. A tool was set aside instead of returned. A boundary was approached more closely than before. Nothing happened. The absence of reaction carried more weight than any reprimand would have, because it suggested that the system itself had begun to disengage. Control still existed on paper, but its presence felt distant and unreliable. Conversations changed in tone rather than content. The men spoke less about rules and more about timing, wondering whether attention would return or continue to drift. Speculation replaced certainty, and uncertainty spread quietly through the barracks. It became harder to predict what mattered and what did not, and that unpredictability eroded confidence far more effectively than strict discipline ever had. The realization emerged gradually, without a single defining moment. It settled into daily life through repetition, through the continued absence of correction, and through the growing sense that the camp operated on inertia rather than intention. The men did not feel trusted, nor did they feel free. They felt overlooked, and being overlooked carried its own weight. By the end of that period, supervision had not vanished, but it had lost its sharpness. Authority no longer felt immediate, and observation no longer felt certain. What replaced it was a quiet awareness that their presence no longer commanded attention. They were still confined, still counted, still recorded, yet somehow no longer fully seen. That realization did not bring comfort. It marked the beginning of a different kind of captivity, one defined not by constant control, but by the unsettling knowledge that no one seemed invested enough to watch closely anymore. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. Once the men accepted that observation had weakened, their behavior began to change in ways that were not immediately visible. There was no sudden rebellion, no open defiance, and no collective decision to test the limits. Instead, the changes appeared quietly, woven into ordinary moments that once carried meaning simply because someone might notice them. Previously, even small actions had been shaped by the expectation of being seen. A bed was made carefully, not for comfort, but for inspection. A line was held straight, not for efficiency, but for order. When that expectation faded, these actions lost their invisible audience. Without observation, effort began to feel optional rather than necessary. Men still followed routines, but with less precision. Not out of resistance, but out of uncertainty. When no reaction followed a small mistake, the mind adjusted. Precision no longer felt essential. Care became selective. Tasks were completed, but without the tension that once accompanied them. This was not freedom, it was detachment. What emerged was a new question, rarely spoken aloud but widely felt. If no one was paying attention, what was the purpose of doing things correctly at all? The question was not defiant but hollow. It did not challenge authority. It simply stopped responding to it with the same urgency. The absence of supervision affected time as much as it affected action. Hours passed without distinction because nothing marked them as significant. When effort produced no recognition and mistakes produced no consequence, the structure of the day softened. Routine remained, but its edges blurred. Days felt longer, not because they were harder, but because they lacked definition. Some men began to conserve energy in subtle ways. Movements slowed slightly. Conversations shortened. Tasks were done adequately, never thoroughly. The discipline learned over years did not vanish, but it no longer felt reinforced. Without reinforcement, habits weakened, not dramatically, but gradually. Importantly, this shift did not bring relief. Being unseen carried its own pressure. The men were still confined, still dependent on the system around them, yet that system no longer seemed fully engaged. The uncertainty this created was deeply unsettling. Punishment could be anticipated. Neglect could not. In this environment, behavior was no longer guided by rules alone, but by interpretation. Each man quietly assessed how much attention remained, how much effort still mattered, and how much could be withdrawn without consequence. These calculations were never shared openly, but they shaped the atmosphere inside the camp. As observation faded, identity began to thin. Roles that once defined behavior, worker, soldier, prisoner, lost clarity. When no one confirmed those roles through supervision, they felt less real. The men were still present, still counted, but increasingly disconnected from the purpose behind their actions. By the end of this phase, obedience had not disappeared. It had changed. It was no longer driven by fear or discipline, but by habit alone. And habits, without reinforcement, do not hold indefinitely. They erode quietly, leaving behind routines that look intact from a distance, but feel empty from within. The men did not yet realize where this erosion would lead. They only knew that being unwatched had altered something fundamental, and that whatever followed would not be marked by confrontation, but by gradual internal withdrawal. As external supervision faded, something else began to fill the space it left behind. Attention did not disappear entirely. It shifted, with guards less present and rules less enforced. The men became more aware of one another, not out of suspicion at first, but out of habit. When authority recedes, people often look sideways before they look outward, searching for cues about how to behave. Small changes in conduct became more noticeable. A man who lingered too long during rest, another who skipped a step in routine. These details would once have mattered only to guards. Now, they mattered to the group, not because anyone intended to police behavior, but because uncertainty made people alert. When a system no longer confirmed boundaries, the group began to feel responsible for maintaining them. This shift altered the atmosphere inside the barracks. Silence took on a new tone. It was no longer only the absence of oversight. It was the presence of awareness. Men became careful not just about what they did, but about how it might appear to others. Being unseen by authority did not mean being unseen at all. In some ways, visibility increased. The reason was simple. Without clear rules being enforced, behavior carried new risks. A man who acted too freely might draw attention back to the group. A man who broke routine too openly might disrupt the fragile balance that had formed. No one said this out loud, but it was understood. Stability depended on everyone moving in roughly the same way. Gradually, informal standards emerged. They were never written or discussed, but they shaped conduct nonetheless. Effort was expected to remain visible, even if it no longer mattered officially. Compliance became something performed for one another rather than for the guards. This performance was not strict, but it was consistent, and consistency brought reassurance. Those who deviated noticeably began to feel the weight of attention. Not punishment, but observation. A glance held slightly longer. A pause in conversation. These were subtle signals, but they were enough. In an environment where attention had grown scarce, even minor forms of it carried meaning. No one wanted to become the focus of uncertainty. This internal monitoring did not feel hostile. It felt protective. The men were not enforcing discipline out of loyalty to the camp, but out of concern for equilibrium. Without external supervision, disorder felt dangerous, not because it would be punished, but because it might provoke the return of control. Order, even an empty one, felt safer than the unknown. At the same time, this new awareness strained relationships. Trust became cautious. Men were less inclined to act independently, not because they feared authority, but because they feared destabilizing the group. Individual judgment was quietly subordinated to collective comfort. Freedom, already unused, narrowed further. Emotion adapted accordingly. Anxiety did not disappear, it relocated. Instead of being directed upward toward authority, it spread sideways among peers. The men measured themselves against one another, adjusting behavior to remain within an invisible range of acceptability. This constant calibration was tiring, but it felt necessary. By this stage, the absence of supervision had not created openness. It had created vigilance of a different kind. The men were still unwatched from above, yet more aware than ever of the space around them. Control had not vanished. It had changed form, settling into the quiet dynamics of the group. What this revealed was unsettling. Even without guards watching closely, behavior did not drift freely. Structure persisted, sustained not by rules, but by mutual observation and shared fear of disruption. The men had not regained autonomy. They had redirected discipline inward. As the days passed, this internal monitoring became normal. No one questioned it. It filled the gap left by fading authority and stabilized life inside the camp. Yet beneath that stability lay a deeper loss. The men were no longer responding to orders or supervision. They were responding to one another's expectations, and that shift would shape everything that followed. For a time, watching one another had filled the gap left by fading authority. It provided boundaries, however informal, and preserved a sense of order that felt necessary for survival. But this arrangement, too, depended on energy and attention. And like everything else inside the camp, that energy did not last forever. Gradually, the men grew tired of monitoring one another. Vigilance required effort, and effort no longer seemed justified when nothing followed it. When deviations occurred and no consequence emerged, even from the group, attention softened. A glance that once lingered now passed quickly. A small break in routine no longer drew notice. The invisible lines that had briefly held behavior in place began to blur. This change did not happen because trust increased. It happened because exhaustion did. Constant awareness of others created tension, and tension became unsustainable over long periods of uncertainty. The men began to withdraw not only from authority, but from mutual expectation. It became easier to look away than to assess, easier to let things pass than to measure them. As peer observation weakened, behavior grew less coordinated, not chaotic but uneven. Some men continued to follow habits out of inertia, while others allowed routines to loosen. The camp did not descend into disorder, but it lost synchronization. Movement no longer carried shared meaning. Each man adjusted privately, guided by personal thresholds rather than collective norms. This fragmentation altered social space. Interactions became quieter and more distant. Without shared standards to uphold, there was little reason to comment on another's behavior. Conversation narrowed to immediate necessities. Silence expanded, not as tension, but as indifference. The men existed alongside one another without actively shaping one another's conduct. Emotion shifted again in response. Anxiety, once redirected sideways, now thinned into dull neutrality. Without authority watching and without peers evaluating, there was nothing left to react to. The absence of attention removed pressure, but it also removed engagement. Feeling less observed did not restore freedom. It reduced significance. The idea of being seen by anyone lost relevance. Actions no longer carried weight because there was no audience to register them. A task completed or neglected felt the same internally. The distinction between effort and neglect softened. Without response, motivation dissolved quietly, leaving behind only what was necessary to endure the day. Time amplified this effect. Days passed with fewer internal markers. Without oversight from above or expectation from within the group, the structure of experience flattened. The men were still present, still alive, still moving through routine, but increasingly disconnected from the meaning of those movements. Life continued, but it felt less anchored. By this stage, the camp had entered a deeper quiet, not the tense quiet of supervision, nor the alert quiet of peer awareness, but a passive stillness. No one was watching closely anymore, and no one was compensating for that absence. Control had not been replaced. It had simply faded. This did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of emptiness. Being unwatched meant being unaccounted for. The men were no longer part of a system that reacted to them. They existed within it without influence. Presence without impact became the defining condition. As peer observation dissolved, the last layer of structure thinned. What remained was routine stripped of oversight, behavior without audience, and days that asked nothing of those living them. The men had moved from being controlled to watching one another to existing without attention at all. This was the quiet threshold. Beyond it lay not rebellion or freedom, but something more subtle. A state where being unseen no longer caused anxiety, because anxiety itself required attention to survive. And as that attention vanished, the camp entered its most silent phase yet, preparing the ground for what would follow when nothing, and no one, seemed to be watching anymore. By the time even peer observation had faded, The men no longer registered the absence of attention as something unusual. It did not feel like loss or relief. It simply became part of the environment, as ordinary as the fences or the barracks themselves. Being unseen no longer provoked reaction, because reaction required the expectation of response, and that expectation had quietly disappeared. Life inside the camp continued with minimal effort. Tasks were completed when necessary and ignored when they were not. No internal alarm sounded when routines loosened further. The men did not ask whether their actions mattered, because nothing suggested that they did. Without an audience, behavior lost its narrative. It no longer pointed toward discipline, resistance, or adaptation. It simply happened. This state altered how the men experienced themselves. Earlier phases of captivity had still involved some form of identity: prisoner, worker, soldier, group member. Now, those labels felt thin and distant. Without observation to reinforce roles, identity softened. The men existed less as defined individuals and more as occupants of time and space, moving through days without needing to account for who they were within them. Emotion adjusted accordingly. Feelings no longer built toward expression or release. Anger, frustration, and even relief appeared briefly and then faded without consequence. Without being seen, emotion found no surface to reflect from. What remained was a steady neutrality that made endurance possible without demanding explanation. Social relationships changed as well. Interaction became minimal and functional. There was no pressure to conform, no incentive to impress, and no reason to signal belonging. Men shared space without shaping one another's behavior. Presence was acknowledged, but not engaged. Community, once formed through shared attention and expectation, dissolved into parallel existence. The guards remained in place, but their presence felt abstract. They still passed through the camp, still counted bodies, still maintained order on paper. Yet their attention no longer carried immediacy. It no longer shaped daily life. Authority existed at a distance, disconnected from the men's internal experience. Being watched had become theoretical. In this environment, motivation narrowed to the most basic level. The men did what was required to remain fed, sheltered, and alive. Anything beyond that felt unnecessary. Effort without recognition felt wasteful. Without consequence, both positive and negative, action lost significance. Survival became automatic rather than intentional. Time reinforced this condition. Days blended together without internal markers. Without oversight to break monotony or expectation to shape behavior, time flattened. The men did not mark progress or decline. They simply continued. Continuation itself became the goal, even if it was never articulated. By the end of this phase, the absence of attention no longer felt like abandonment. It felt normal. The men were still confined, still within the same physical boundaries, but psychologically they occupied a space where being seen no longer mattered. The system did not respond to them, and they no longer responded to it. This was not freedom. It was not control. It was something quieter, a condition where existence required no acknowledgement, and where being unseen became the default state. The men lived on, not because they were watched, and not because they were free, but because life continued even when nothing seemed to be watching anymore. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the moment when being unseen became permanent. There was no realization, no discussion, and no final adjustment. Life inside the camp simply continued in a quieter form, shaped by routines that no longer required oversight and actions that no longer waited for response. The men did not feel abandoned, nor did they feel released. They had adapted to a condition where attention no longer guided behavior and absence no longer demanded explanation. being watched had once defined the boundaries of their days. Now, those boundaries existed without reinforcement, held together only by habit and time. What remained was not freedom, and it was not control. It was a narrowed way of existing, where effort was measured carefully and meaning was drawn only from what allowed the day to pass. The camp still stood, the routine still functioned, and life continued without interruption. And in that quiet continuity, the men carried on, not reacting to authority and no longer responding to its absence, moving forward through days that asked little of them, in a place where no one seemed to be watching anymore. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.